Hi, everyone, and welcome to TheFIX, the podcast that's all about Lightroom, Photoshop, and what you do with your photos after the shoot. I'm your co-host, Jan Kabili. I'm here with my co-host, Sean Duggan. Hi, Sean.
Hey, Jan, how you doing?
Doing great. How are you tonight?
I'm really well, doing excellent.
I'm really glad to hear that. We have a very exciting show to bring you tonight. The topic tonight is moving from Aperture to Lightroom. And we have a special guest who knows all about that, Mr. Gene McCullagh. Gene is the man behind the popular Lightroom Secrets blog, and he's also an author and a photographer in his own right. So we're very excited to have him with us to explain everything you need to know to move from Aperture to Lightroom. Hi, Gene.
Hi, Jan. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. And thank you for coming. I'm really excited to find out what you have to show us, because I know that this is a problem that a lot of people have when they're trying to move from Aperture to Lightroom. They run into all kind of roadblocks, and we've got you here to guide us through that process.
Well, at least I'll take you through the basic initial steps, and getting that far is usually half the battle anyway, so.
Well, great. Now, before we do that, I want to tell you that I've got a really exciting announcement, but I'm going to hold that announcement for the end of the show. So I hope that all of you who are watching or listening will hang out to the very end so you can hear that big, life-changing announcement.
I'll be here.
You will be here. I know you will. So great. So, Gene, tell us a little about the background. Like, why are people moving from Aperture to Lightroom in the first place?
Well, if you're an Apple user, you had the choice in the beginning with, do I go with Aperture or do I go with Lightroom? And essentially both programs were photo management, catalog management, keywording, development, and so on kind of utilities, something the Windows users didn't have. So the Windows people have been fine sitting there with Lightroom, but Apple users had this choice. And it had gone along where Lightroom and Aperture were leapfrogging each other with different tools and capabilities. And then Apple, for some reason, decided that they were no longer going to support a lot of the pro areas. You know, the first fiasco came with the video people when they changed their program and kind of dumbed it down to a little bit. They were telling people that we're not going to do Aperture anymore. We're going to stop doing it. It's going to have an end of life. And you were left there then with Aperture and iPhoto. And they said there's something new coming that will be better than iPhoto and will meet the needs of the people using Aperture somewhere. So that first phase, people kind of held back and didn't take the plunge into Lightroom right away. Some did. And then when Photos came out, you know, I wish they would not name their products like that. Trying to do a Google search on Photos comes with all sorts of baggage. So they came out with Photos, and really what it was a little better iPhoto, but nothing close to what Aperture did. So now once Photos is out, more and more people are saying, okay, it's time for me to take a look at Lightroom.
So just to be clear, when you're saying Photos, you're talking about an Apple application, a desktop application of Photos for OS X.
Right, so instead of iPhoto and Aperture, they got rid of both of those and moved to a product of Photos, which is supposedly somewhere between the two. So better for the iPhoto users, too bad for the pros and the high-end amateurs.
Why is it too bad for the pros and high-end amateurs?
Well, Photos just doesn't have the same power that Aperture had. The editing tools and the different kind of tools for catalog management just are not in Photos the way they were in Aperture. So
I was going to interject that I just spent 3 weeks actually teaching on some cruise ships over in the Baltic Sea. It was really fun. One of the programs that they asked me to teach there was the Photos application for OS X, and I was really amazed at how consumer oriented it is. Mm-hmm. It seemed even more so than iPhoto.
Right.
And really no equivalent for Aperture or Lightroom.
No. And that's why we're now starting to see more and more people starting to think about taking that plunge. But they're, after you've been an Aperture user for years and years, just like a Lightroom user, you've developed your catalogs and your albums and your collections and your keywords and all of these things, and you've made adjustments to your images. And there's a problem in that while you can move from Aperture to Lightroom, not everything translates. So there's going to be a little pain involved. But Lightroom has some tools in there that will help you get from Aperture over to Lightroom, and then once you're there, you'll have a little more work to get things back the way you want it. But once you're there and you do that work, I think you'll be much happier. So.
So what are the big issues that people face when they're going from Aperture to Lightroom? The things you're going to address, I hope, by sharing your screen later in the podcast.
Yes. Well, the big issues are Aperture users had the opportunity to either keep their images as managed images, and they were in this package file similar to what iPhotos and what Photos does, or they could keep their images as a reference base the way Lightroom looks at images. Images stay somewhere on the disk, and the program would reference their location. And some users, unfortunately, did both in one catalog. So they've got some managed and some referenced, so they have a little more work to do. And so the real problem exists with there's more work on the managed side, because when you move from Aperture to Lightroom, you've got to pull them out of this little folder file, reset up a file structure, and then let Lightroom, go through and take a look at those. The other big issue, which there really is no way around, is that if I have an image and I've done extensive work on it in Aperture, I'm not going to be able to keep that work when I get to Lightroom. I can bring my original, and I can bring, an end product, but I'll lose all of the steps in between. So, for example, in Lightroom, if you've done steps along the way, you can roll back. You can, go back in time and change some of those alterations you've done, and you could do that in Aperture. But once you make that transition, those steps don't translate between the two programs. So you can bring an original and your end product and stack them together, but you're going to lose those steps in between.
I see. So that sounds really huge, and we'll be interested to so you can really show us what the problem is. And you say you have no way around it, but I bet you've got some ideas.
Well, I'll kind of walk you through. There's a couple of things to the recommended path that Adobe says to do it is a little dangerous, so I'm going to show you a more secure way. So in case you're already a Lightroom user that happens to also be an Aperture user, and now you want to bring everything over, you don't destroy your existing catalog in the process.
So Sean, do you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, I actually have helped a couple of clients with this very procedure, and I'm not an Aperture user, but I studied up on it and figured out how the Adobe Aperture Migration Assistant worked. And in one case, it worked fine and everything came over okay, and yet in another case, it just sort of stalled in the process. It kind of went through all the motions like it was going to do it, and then it kind of got tripped up on something and just couldn't migrate the Aperture catalog over. So the workaround that I found, and I'm sort of still in the middle of this, we're kind of doing it piecemeal, is my client had all of her images subdivided up into Aperture projects or albums, whatever the nomenclature in Aperture was for that. And so what I figured out I could do is I could select one of those Aperture projects or Aperture albums, and I could export that as a brand new Aperture library, sort of almost like in Lightroom you could take a collection and export it as a new catalog. And then I was able to import that new Aperture library into Lightroom, and then that worked. So that told me that somewhere along the way, maybe there's, I don't know, a few corrupt files or something that are just causing it to hang up on the process. And the other thing that I want to point out that I did, and I would highly or strongly suggest that people do this, and maybe Gene, you can speak to that, is that rather than import the Aperture libraries directly into the main Lightroom catalog, I created a totally separate Lightroom catalog that I used to import the Aperture libraries into that separate Lightroom catalog. And then once everything is in there and everything's looking good, we can either do some cleanup in there and then merge those two Lightroom catalogs, or merge that Lightroom catalog with my main Lightroom catalog. So I wanted to sort of keep it separate while I was doing the Aperture import until everything was smooth, and then I could merge them together.
Great minds think alike, Sean. That's exactly what I tell people to do.
Well, that's great. So those are the kinds of problems that you can run into, and a couple of ways that you can maybe get out of them and be safe along the way. But now I know, Gene, that you have a workflow that you want to share with us.
Yes.
Would you be able to do that? Go ahead and share your screen and
sure.
Take us through that.
But I first want to just, if you haven't investigated what's going on in reference versus managed, if you're an Aperture user and maybe you didn't really understand what was going on, or now you want to try to figure out where all your things are, in a managed library, this is that package that I was talking about. It shows up just as one single file, but it's actually a package folder. And when you look inside of a managed library package, you'll see these subfolders, and masters is where you'll see where the Aperture is stored in this strange nomenclature here, all of your images. However, if you looked inside of a reference folder, and that's the kind that, similar to Lightroom, where you leave things out on the disk and you reference where they are, you have the same package, but when you look inside of that package, you'll notice that the masters subfolder is empty, because the images don't live in the package, they live out on the disk in whatever file structure you've put together. So what I wanted to do is just kind of walk through the process, the way I guide people through, and just show you some of the things to consider when you're going from Aperture to Lightroom.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Is the default the managed option?
Yes.
So if you didn't know what you were doing, you probably have a managed setup rather than a reference setup.
Correct. You have managed, and that's the first thing we're going to look at here. Is I've created these. I use these little tiny libraries to kind of walk people through and point out things, and then I can set them loose on their entire Aperture libraries. But here, for example, is a managed library. So if you right-click on any of these photos, you will not see a Show in Finder option, because it's inside of that package that we just saw. So we've got these 4 images here. These 2 happen to be stacked together. And so if you're familiar in Lightroom, you can stack images together and collapse them. There's some different star ratings on your images. You may have flagged an image. When you look at keywords, there are 2 keywords in this file. So every one of these images, if we look at it, has the keyword managed on it. We want to see if our keywords will also come over. And this one has managed and a name. Okay. So the first thing you want to do before you do anything with making this transition is to go through your Aperture library, make sure that you don't have any warning signs of corrupted files or something that just doesn't look right. And then you also want to make sure that you select all your images, and before you make the transition, you're going to go to this metadata menu item in Aperture, and you want to write all that IPTC metadata out to your originals. This way we're sure that whatever you've collected as far as IPTC data, and that's going to be, if you look at the information here, the address and the email and website and keywords and that kind of stuff, copyright kind of notices. You want to make sure that whatever you spend time creating in your Aperture library for each of these images gets written out, so that when they come over to Lightroom, Lightroom has a better chance of seeing those. And
what do you mean by written out? You mean written into the file? Written to what?
Right. Well, Aperture had a similar system to Lightroom where you could work on something in the Aperture library like you can in the Lightroom catalog, and you could either choose to have that information automatically written out every time it was changed, or to make the program run quicker, you could have the information stored in the catalog, not out in each individual file. So for example, if I applied the keyword manage to an image, it might live in the Aperture library, but if I would have opened that image elsewhere in another program, that keyword might not be in there if I hadn't written it out to the image file itself.
I have a question on that topic, yes. Gene.
Mm-hmm.
Does Lightroom, or no Lightroom, does Aperture do something similar to Lightroom when you're applying keywords to raw files Lightroom, of course, does not change the actual raw file. So if you were going to save the metadata to the file in Lightroom, it's going to create an XMP file, a sidecar file to kind of go along with the main file. Is Aperture using a similar methods when you're working with raw files?
I'm not sure, Sean. I think it kept it in the catalog if it couldn't write it to the file.
I see.
But as I said, I'm not a hardcore Aperture user like yourself. I mean, I learned the program basically back when the Lightroom Aperture wars were going on, just to be able to converse between the two worlds. But yeah, that's something I'll have to look into that, because that's a good question. Okay. So once you've gone through your catalog and you made sure everything looks right and you've written out that metadata, that's a nice word to say, what I recommend is exactly what Sean recommended, and that is to start your Lightroom up and go immediately. If this is your main catalog, the first thing you want to do is to go up to the File menu and say New Catalog, and then pick where you're going to put your catalog for now. And I'm just going to stick this with doing Manage first. So I'm going to stick it in this folder here, and I'll just call it A2LR. And next, if I can type, Managed.
And of course, it doesn't matter where you put a catalog.
No.
Lightroom catalogs can be anywhere. You can move them around.
Except on network drives.
Right, they don't go on network. You cannot put them on network.
Yeah, the
drives.
two caveats is they can't go on a network drive and they can't go on a read-only drive. And you could put them on there, but they wouldn't work very well. So when you do create a catalog, it's going to ask you when you're leaving this catalog what you want to do as far as backups. I'm just going to skip for this time. And that will open up a brand spanking new catalog with nothing in it.
Okay.
Okay, so here we have a blank catalog, and we want to bring in this Aperture library. And the way you find that information or that utility is under the File menu, go to Plugin Extras, and you'll see the plugin. Now, there's a little oddity here, and I don't know if you've seen this too, Sean. In a brand new catalog, the import from Aperture library is grayed out. So what I usually have lying around is just a placeholder image that I use. So I'll first go and import this placeholder image. And I don't know why it does this, but it does.
In other words, until you have some image in this new library, in this new Lightroom catalog, you will not be able to import your Aperture images.
Yeah, if it doesn't activate the tool for some reason. So I'll just bring this one placeholder, and see, it says placeholder, so you know what it is. And I don't really care where it comes. I just want to get it in the catalog. So once we have an image in the catalog, if we go back to File, Plugin Extras, now we can see that the import from Aperture library is available. And by the way, just as a side note, if you're not an Aperture user but you were using iPhoto and you don't like photos, there's also a plugin here to import from your iPhoto library, and pretty much the same steps here. So if you're not interested in Aperture but you want to get away from iPhoto, you can do that too. So you go to Import from Aperture library, and a deceptively simple looking box comes up, which merely says, okay, what library do you want to go from, and where do you want to put your images? And you can, if that's not the library that you want, you'll see Aperture library and a listing of what you're looking for. If that's not the one, you can hit the select button, go and navigate and find that library. I'm going to change where these images are going to, just to keep everything sequestered. So I'm going to go to my desktop, to my Managed, and I have a little folder here, or I would create a folder called Images just to place my images, and that's in the same folder that I put the Lightroom catalog in, just so I keep everything together in one place and organized. So I'm going to stick images in there. So the plugin tells me I have 4 images, it's 20 megabytes, and all this disk space. The real power down here is in the options. There's a little button in the lower left-hand corner called Options. When you open that up, you get some more choices. And here's where you can start looking at what to do with some of these images and previews. So for images that have been adjusted in Aperture, you can import a full-size preview from the library. So this is where we talked about before, where you may have an image in your library that you've made adjustments to. If we don't check that box, you'll get the original and none of the adjustments. So if you want to bring in a preview of the finished product, I check the box that says for images which have been adjusted in Aperture, import full-size previews. The next section deals with keywords. Now you may have, just like we do in Lightroom, lots of keywords, but not all of them have applied to images. So you can either bring all your keywords in, or you can say that I only want to bring in keywords that have been applied to images. I don't want all the extra ones. So let's leave those back there. Now, as I said before, not everything that happens in Aperture will translate over. So one of these is color labels. So what the tool does is it lets you say, if I've applied a color label in Aperture, let's create a keyword in Lightroom with that color. So we can check that box so that if I've applied a color label, I'll get a keyword on that image. Likewise, if I've stacked images in Aperture, let's create a keyword for the stack so I know which images were stacked together. Then we've got the reference files. Now in this case, we're doing a managed library, so it really doesn't matter much what goes on in reference. We'll take a look at the reference section when we take a look at importing a reference library. And these become important at that point. So we say OK to those, and then all we then do is say import, and it's going to run through and bring these images in. And a small catalog, it comes in relatively quickly. It'll tell you when it's complete, and when you hit done, it then gives you all this nice little information that photo and videos imported from Aperture have been added to the collections panel under From Aperture. Faces, color labels, stacks have been imported, mapped to keywords. For more information, press F1 and go to Lightroom Help. So let's see what we got. Well, we can see right away that our stars that we applied in Aperture did translate over well, so that's good. We can see that we have this image that was in Aperture came from this image. This is our original, but in Aperture it was a black and white. So we brought the original in, and we created a full-size preview of the black and white final product.
Oh, so you get both?
You get both. If you choose to have previews of, a full-size preview of adjustments. If I didn't check that box, I would just have gotten the original, and this black and white adjustment would come over.
I guess I don't understand that. Was the original color, or was the original black and white?
The original.
Okay.
And then in Aperture, I had turned it into black and white and made some adjustments.
Correct. So if you had not checked the box to bring in the preview, you would only have the color,
right.
The original. Yes.
Likewise down here with Melanie, this was the original, this is color corrected. Since that's the end product, that would not have come in if I didn't check the box. I'd have to redo my color corrections from the original here.
So that must really freak people out, especially if they don't understand what that long phrase means that you checked.
Right.
And it's not exactly clear from the language, I don't think.
No, it's not. So that's one of the places they trip up. They say, no, I don't want to bring in previews. I'll build previews in Lightroom. Lightroom builds previews, and they bring in these images and say, wait a minute, that was black and white, or how come the colors are off?
Yeah.
So it's important to realize what's going on there. So what Lightroom does for you is it creates a collection over here that says From Aperture. And what it's going to bring in is, if you have any projects, so we had projects in our catalog, it's going to bring those projects in as collections. So we had an album called Album, and so that was what was in that Aperture album. We had a My Project, and we had photos in there. So it will kind of retain those album and project structures in this From Aperture collection set in the collections area. It also will come down and show you what photos were adjusted in Aperture. So it counts both the original and the adjustment. So that's why we see 6. We have 3 originals and their corresponding finals. So we get 6 in that collection. And then if we had marked any as rejected in Aperture, that we would have something in there. If we had a most recent import, well, obviously that's the most recent import for Aperture. If we're doing more than one catalog, it would start collecting those. The other thing to note is that when you look over here in keywords, we started out with no keywords because it was a new file, but you see we had the keyword manage. Let's just go back up to all photos here. I'm just going to get rid of placeholder now since I don't need it. So we see we have managed, and that's applied. If I select all of these images, that keyword manage came over. It came over not only for the original, but for the end result. So the keywords came over from Aperture, which is good. We got this Melanie keyword, which was basically a translation of the face recognition in Aperture. And I wish that they had found a way to make the face recognition directly correlate to the new Lightroom face recognition, but that wasn't in the cards. But we'll see a little bit how to fix that. And then there's also a new set of keywords on Aperture features. And this is where we can see color labels. There's nothing with a color label. Here we have the Aperture stacks. So in Aperture we had a stack. And if you're not familiar with, with the keyword panel, when you have keywords and you have multiple images, at the end of that line there's an arrow. If you click on the arrow, it will just show you, it will filter down to those images. So this was a stack in Aperture. So if we wanted to, we could then come in and do the same thing. Now that we're in Lightroom, we can come here and we can go up to our photos, stacking, group into stack. And so now we would have that stacked together as well. So this
okay, so do you mind if I say for the people who can't watch you and
yes.
are listening? So tell me if I'm correct about this, that if you had color labels applied to photos in Aperture, if you had put photos into a stack in Aperture, those things would not come into Lightroom as color labels or as Lightroom color labels or as Lightroom stacks.
Correct.
Instead, they would come into Lightroom as keywords, and then you could make your own stacks or apply your own color labels in Lightroom later.
Right, and using this keyword panel, the keyword list, you can pick each one of these groups here. Like this Aperture stack 1 I have highlighted has 2 images in it. So in Aperture, that was a 2-image stack, and there's an arrow at the end of that row. When I click on that, that creates a filter that just gets me to those 2 images only, and that makes it easy to just recreate the stack, so to speak. So if you wanted to recreate the stacks you had in Aperture, once you get them over, you can go through the different stack packages that are in the keyword list, recreate your stacks. Now you'll notice that when you hover over this, it says 3 of 3. And the reason for that is if we go back to all photographs, let's kill the filter here. Remember that the tool automatically stacks together, because we chose it to, the original and the final image. So that came into Lightroom as a stack, and then we added the original other image from the Aperture stack into it because these 2 were stacked together. So you wind up with a stack of 3 because one of them was altered, and that created a stack. And then you see down here with the 2 images of Melanie, that created an automatic stack because it stacks the preview that was created in Aperture on top of the stack, so you know what your final image was, and then it tucks in the original at the bottom of the stack.
Hey, Gene?
Yes.
I have a question about the color labels in Aperture. When those keywords come over, do they say red label, green label, etc., or does it just say red or green?
Well, we'll see when we get to the reference, because I have some color labels in that one. I think it says red label, but we'll see. The last thing to do is if you've got faces applied in Aperture, you're going to get a faces section over here in your keywords, and then you can just go there and open up faces. Yes, start finding faces. No people found. There's a people found. So you got these 2 people found, and you've got Melanie as one of your keywords, so then you can go and you're going to have to retype your names in. So you've got a lot of names going on there. Then you can recreate your names. So while it's a lot of work, and if you have a large Aperture library, it's going to be some work. You can get it back to the state you had it, and then start moving forward in Lightroom and enjoying yourself. But that's the managed library side. Let me just go through the reference library side, and you'll see a little difference.
I have a question now about what just happened.
Yes.
There was a keyword Melanie that was not an official Lightroom people keyword because it came over from Aperture.
Right.
It seemed to me you just tried to create a new people keyword called Melanie. I don't see it over there in the keyword list.
In the keyword list?
On the right side, there should now be is that a people keyword, Melanie?
Well, here's our faces.
There it is.
Here.
There it is. There
Okay.
it is.
That's our faces from Aperture, and this is our new applied Melanie keyword.
Okay.
Okay.
So it doesn't take the original keyword and
No.
make it into a people keyword in Lightroom.
I wish.
It creates a new people keyword in Lightroom.
Right. So yeah, you will have some cleanup to do, but I think it was very smart of Adobe to lay everything out in collections and keyword packages so that you could kind of have a roadmap to get your catalog back to the way it was. And then once you do, I mean, you can start getting rid of all these. Like I would no longer need this keyword because I've now recreated my stack. So I would just come in there and I could just get rid of that keyword. So that I can clean up my keyword list once I'm done massaging my data from Lightroom. I mean from Aperture. And so the other thing to look at is the way these now get pulled in. Remember, they were inside of a package. So what the Lightroom plugin does is it pulls right out of the package. If you remember from the package, they were these strange date configurations. So it's going to pull in these images and create these year, month, and then year, month, day subfolders to place them in. So if you don't like all of that, you may want to massage it around. Otherwise, it's just I really don't pay a lot of attention to where Lightroom puts these because I'm confident that it's keeping track of it for me. So I don't care if they're really all in one folder, but some people get very picky about how their images are categorized on the actual disk itself. So if you're one of those people, then you can, if you don't like this structure at the end, you just want to say, I don't care what day it was, I want everything that's in August to be in August. You can just come into that folder, select everything, and then just drag it up there and move them up into the August folder. And then once that day folder or the days folder that you have under August are done, you can just get rid of the folder. And that would then give you a year and a month. So that can clean it up in some respects. But you really have to make a decision on how you want to, to have these things arranged on the disk. So now instead of being in a package, these are living on your hard drive, out in the open and not tied up in a package anywhere.
So that's not too, it's a lot of steps, but it's not too difficult to understand. I do have one question.
Mm-hmm.
Everything I see on your screen right now is a JPEG. I don't recall if you started with all JPEGs, and my question is, what happens if you start with RAW files in Aperture? Do they come into Lightroom as RAW files, or are they changed?
Here's a DNG right here.
Good.
Yeah, it'll preserve whether it's TIFFs, DNGs, RAW files. You'll always get a JPEG for your preview. So even if you have a DNG, for example, this was the original uncorrected image. This is the final corrected image from Aperture. That's going to come in as a JPEG.
And will it always come as a JPEG, or sometimes as a TIFF or a PSD, depending on some preference somewhere?
No, for this particular transition, it's just going to go in there, look at the final image, create a full-size preview JPEG from it, and stick it and stack it.
Great.
And then if you want to get back to this in a non-JPEG form, you'll have to kind of redevelop your original, but now at least you have the end product as a reference to look at. Okay. So just to quickly take this through on the reference side, On the reference side, the images are already living in a structure out on the disk. So if I would just to look at where the originals are here, so for a reference library, I have them all living. Reference library. There they are. They're all living in a folder out there on the drive. So remember, we looked at what the package for reference, and there was nothing inside of it because all the image was being referenced to by Aperture and not living in its package. So let's take a look and see how that goes. So again, I would tell people create a new catalog. Let's go back to Lightroom. File, new catalog. And again, I would stick it in one folder so we can keep track of everything. So I'm going to stick it in there and call it A2LR referenced. We know what it is. And we're going to have the exact same issue we had with the other catalog. When it comes in, it's brand new and there's nothing in it. The Aperture migration tool will not be active.
Are you creating a separate catalog for the referenced and the managed photos just as a teaching tool, or is that something you really recommend people do?
No, if they have a mixed catalog, this plugin will handle both kinds. But some people are all managed, and they took the default, and other people were specific in keeping everything referenced, so they didn't have it tied up inside that package. So if you have a reference library, this is really just teaching tool. The point here is that don't bring it into your existing catalog if you have one. Do it separately. If you have several Aperture libraries, I would recommend doing each one separately. So I would create a new Lightroom catalog, import one library, clean it up, and then bring that into my master catalog when I'm done. And then I can discard, the working catalog that I did for this transition. So again, if we look at the plugins under File, that is not active. So we'll just go through that dance we did and bring in some placeholder image. And it can be any image that you want. It doesn't have to be, an image for placeholder. I just keep one of these around just for it's useful in teaching. So we'll just bring that in. Now we have it. And so once we have it, then we have access to the plugin extras import from Aperture library. This time, we're going to switch to the reference library. And I'm going to stick those resulting images into the same folder I've just created for the Lightroom catalog into an images folder. So I can just keep it all organized. And now we have 5 images in this catalog, and we'll look at the options for this. Now it becomes important when we get down to references. So again, I'm going to choose the option to bring in a full-size preview for any final adjustment images I've done in Aperture, because I do want to have that. It's full-size, I can use it, and it also gives me a reference point if I want to redevelop the original to get back to that in Lightroom. Again, I only want to import keywords that are applied in Aperture. I do want keywords for color labels. I do want keywords for any stacks. And now we have this section here for referenced files, and there's 2 choices. It comes up by default in reference to, for reference images left in their original location, place version previews in the same folder as the master image to allow for automatic stacking. So what this is telling you is that we're going to leave reference files in their original location, and when it builds that preview, put that preview in whatever folder its original is in. So that puts them together logically, and then that will allow for stacking. There's another section here which says leave reference files in your Aperture library in their current location. If I check that, it unchecks the second box, and I don't know why they did it this way. If you've already got your images in a folder structure you like, and if you're an Aperture user that went to the trouble of making a referenced library, you probably have the images where you want them. So I would say check the box to leave them exactly where they are on the disk, because you know where they are and they're in all the folders you want. and then I would recheck that box that says put the previews in the same location. I don't know why it unchecks it when you pick the first one, but it does. So now instead of building that tree structure we saw with the managed library, which just takes dates and years, months, and year, month, day, since you already have a reference library and it's sitting out on the disk in a structure you like, I would recommend you choose to leave those files where they are, because they're already where you like them, and then recheck the box to put any previews in the same folders as the images. So once we say OK to that, and we import this library, we see the images come in, the import's complete. When we say done, we get the usual dialog box about what went on and where things are. I'm just going to go up to all photos, and I'm going to get rid of that placeholder since we don't need that anymore. And I wanted to point something out. When we look now at what's going on, when we did the managed library and we brought it into Lightroom and stuck the images here, it created these folders for us that we saw and put the images in these folders, you know, by the dates and day, month, days, and all that. That was a managed library. We told Lightroom in this time to come through and leave things where they were. So if I were to look in the referenced catalog now in the images folder, there's nothing there. Even though I set that up, nothing came over because I told Lightroom leave things where they are because that's where I want to see them. So now if you see the originals are there, and it also followed what I asked it to do. It built a preview for this Flora 1 JPEG and stuck it in the same folder as the original Aperture file, image file. So it did everything we wanted it to do. So we don't have things moving around the disk. If you've built a structure you like, it's going to stay in place if you have a reference library. And then when we get over to Lightroom, we have the same kinds of things going on. We have a collection here. The collections, you have the From Aperture collection, and it's going to have your albums. And here we have two albums, Album 1 and Album 2, which apparently have the same images in them. We've got the projects, My Reference Project, got project photos there. We've got photos adjusted in Aperture. It'll say 2 because it's the original and the preview. We have no photos rejected in Aperture. When we look at our keywords, we've got the Aperture's feature set, and now we see the color labels. So here's the answer, Sean. It comes in just as the color name: blue, green, orange, red, yellow. So I could then go through this and say, okay, I'll go find that blue one, and then I can apply a blue label here to this. So my labels were set up differently, but this will give you a guide right into what the color labels were. You can also go see your Aperture stacks. This catalog had 2 stacks, so we have Aperture Stack 1. Very original names they give them too, by the way. Aperture Stack 1, Aperture Stack 2. So I can come back in again and recreate these stacks. We've got the faces from Aperture. Now it's very odd. I don't know why it brings this in and also builds the keyword. But if we were to go to this faces from Aperture and then apply faces here, we'd have to then say, okay, this is John. So then we'll go in here and put John. Now we applied that face, and now it just checks the box. So it looks, Jan, like it is actually pulling in a name, but until we actually do that process, it doesn't consider it to be a name keyword until we've actually attached it to there.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, but then you can always, if you have multiple faces in Aperture, you'll get those names in here, and you can just use this auto filter to get to them, and then just assign the names, and you're back to naming your things that you want. And then here we applied the keyword reference to all the files, so the keyword did come over, so all the keywords were applied and they came over. So, you know, it looks like it did the same thing we wanted it to do. The big boon here is that if you had a reference library to begin with that had what you wanted already on there, then you got to keep everything in the same place it was. The only caveat I would give to folks is that if you're making this transition from Aperture to Lightroom and you have a reference library, once you make the transition, don't edit those photos in Aperture again, because now Aperture's library and Lightroom's catalog are both pointing to the same image files. And if you start messing around in Aperture again, when you come back to your Lightroom catalog, you may have some surprises waiting for you. So, so just bite the bullet, make the transition, and then leave Aperture behind.
That makes sense. You know, I've also heard some people suggest that if all this is too much for you, you just keep all your existing photos as they were in Aperture and start fresh with the photos you take from here on.
Oh yeah, you could do
Lightroom.
that.
And
Yeah.
then so you'll have Aperture for the old ones, Lightroom for the new ones.
Right. The only downside to that is that Aperture is no longer being updated, and as OS 10 progresses, Aperture at some point is going to reach end of life. And if you haven't made the transition, you're going to be faced with, okay, my only route now is to migrate from Aperture to Photos, or whatever the equivalent is when that time comes, because I don't know how long, when Lightroom progresses. Let's say we're 3 years down the road and we're on, OS 13 and Lightroom is up to, CC 2018 or something, and it now no longer reads Aperture libraries because, well, Aperture went away years ago. You face that risk if you leave them there.
Sure, I understand.
Yeah. But if you don't like the way this turns out, let me just share with you one utility that some people have used and say is rather good, and I'm going to violate the, well, I'll just do this. I won't open up your face there. I'll just open up a Safari window. And if you've got a large and extensive set of libraries, this might be worthwhile. This is a product from Blue Pill software called Aperture Exporter. And let me just show you that. What Aperture Exporter gives you is a lot more control over how things wind up in the end. And in fact, you don't even need Lightroom to do this, but it'll make a Lightroom for you. But you have this idea here where you have to have your Aperture running. Right now, we have the manage file open, and you have control over the file naming. So you have a whole choice here of how do you want to name the files when they get exported out. So you can do some file naming changes. You can create folders for albums and smart albums. You can create keywords for images and albums and smart albums. You can tag faces with keywords, so that's similar to what we're doing now, make a keyword out of a face tag. This advanced option box gives you a lot of control over creating separate files for each version, create 16-bit TIFFs with adjustments, file naming, you can set up file naming, keywording, you've got different tags you can apply for, flagged, colors, not pick of stack, these kind of things here. You can even set up rules where for things you rate between 1 and 3 stars, I only want you to create a JPEG. But if I want TIFFs for things that are rated at 4 stars or above, so you can kind of decide what you want. You can get TIFFs out of here for your preview images. You can ignore images that are tagged no adjustments. You can pick your destination folder, and then you can export there. And then once you have all of that done, then you can just go to Lightroom, create a catalog, and then just import that as is after all said and done. And a lot of people have gotten a lot of success with this, and they have a little more flexibility with it. It will cost you $20. I think that's what it's running for now. But if you're not satisfied with the built-in plugin to do that, this is another good alternative I've seen people have great success with. So, and that's from Blue Pill software, and I have no stake in this company, and I'm not getting anything back from it. Just to be clear, it's at apertureexporter.com. So.
Terrific. So, is that basically what you had to show us?
That's what I had to show you, and just I think it's important for. Let's see. where are you? There you are. It's important for users that are making this transition to understand that there's going to be some work involved. But if you were hanging on hoping that the new program from Apple would be the new Aperture, unfortunately, you've been disappointed. It's really the new iPhotos Pro. So it's time to come over to Lightroom. Hey, I've been telling people for years, don't go with Aperture, go with Lightroom. So now maybe they say, I don't want to say I told you so, but I told you so.
Good for you. You were very prescient in that. And of course, I've said the same. What I love about Lightroom is that it works so well with the other applications I use, Photoshop.
Yep.
So
and now
there always was that. And now
there's that photographer package. It's like, it's a no-brainer. I mean, $10 a month. I mean, if you consider the calculation of upgrading your Photoshop every so often and upgrading your Lightroom, $10 a month is cheap. Plus, you get all the access to the mobile applications, and I think it's a good deal. So,
I agree.
Well, that was really great information, Gene. Thanks so much for sharing that with us. I know I learned a lot, and I'm certainly going to apply some of those techniques to the next time that I have to help somebody transition from Aperture.
Well, thanks, Sean. It was a pleasure.
No, and I think that for those Aperture users out there, one of the key points from this episode is that if you have not switched over yet, there's no time like the present. I definitely would do it soon, because as OS 10 becomes OS 11, and then after that OS 12, there will come a point where you're not going to be able to open Aperture in future versions of the Mac OS.
Right.
Yeah, so great information. So I hope that everybody enjoyed that out there and found that useful, you Aperture users. So Jan, you hinted at the beginning of the show that you had some big news. What's the story?
Well, I do have some big news, but before I say anything about it, I would like to know where people can reach Gene online, because he's such a wealth of information, not only on this topic, but about all things Lightroom. Where can we find you, Gene?
Well, thanks, Jan. You can find me at lightroomsecrets.com, or you can get me on Twitter at LRSecrets. And I do a lot with people one-on-one, and when I have the time and inclination and the answer, I'd get emails, and then we'll hook up with people and try to solve their issues in Lightroom. So, I don't do that for a living. It's just I'm a Lightroom enthusiast, and I've been an Adobe community professional for many years, and just like to promote the Lightroom cause.
Well, that's terrific, and I'm sure all our viewers are happy to know that they have a lifeline. There is someone they can contact if they just can't figure it out, and you will help them on a one-to-one basis. That's great.
I will.
Great. So now I have some big news. It's kind of bittersweet. The bitter part is that this is probably going to be the last broadcast of TheFIX on which you're going to see me. I am stepping back. Handing over the reins, and I'm no longer going to be the host of TheFIX. Now, there's a good reason for this. First, let me say, I love TheFIX. It really is my baby. I started it along with Frederick Van Johnson about 9 months ago now, and we've really nurtured it, brought on terrific guests, gotten great response from all of you out there, and I really appreciate everything, all the comments and the suggestions from you all. So thank you for sticking with us and helping us build up this podcast to what it is today. Now, the podcast is going to continue. Don't worry. There still will be TheFIX with all of the great stuff that we've been bringing you all along and more. However, I won't be here. Now, let me tell you the sweet part. The reason that I won't be spending time on TheFIX is that I'm going to be devoting all my energy to a new position, a full-time position with Adobe Systems. That's right. Wow. I'm going to be working at Adobe. How about that?
Round of applause. Eh?
Thank you. I'm so excited. I'm so excited. And the job is with the Adobe Learn team, where I'm going to be working with the team to create and curate Adobe's online content. It's learning content for Photoshop, Lightroom, and the Adobe photography-related apps. So it's right down my alley. It's the dream job for me, and I'm just really excited, and I want to put all my energies into that effort. So I won't be here on TheFIX anymore, but I'll be thinking about you all, and I'll be watching, and I know that I'm leaving TheFIX in good hands.
Excellent news. Well deserved. Yeah, good news. Congratulations, Jan.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, then. So that's all we have for tonight. Let's sign off, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode and that you continue to come back to thisweekinphoto.com to watch TheFIX and the other great podcasts that you'll find there.